Welcome back. It's hard to believe that this is our last official session of mid-year. These events seem to go by so quickly, but the energy and momentum doesn't need to stop when mid-year is over. NASCIO is an active group year-round. There are monthly forums on large topics, ad hoc webcasts, and plenty of opportunities to stay involved. Please visit the NASCIO community. It is the best way to stay connected. One discussion that will certainly have life after this event is the CIO's role in addressing fraud. This is certainly not a new issue, but one that has received increased attention over the past few years. The large influx of funds to states from the feds meant a large influx of fraudulent activity. Reducing and preventing fraud is vital for public trust as states want to be good stewards of our taxpayer dollars. The next panel will discuss just this. What are state CIOs and their offices currently doing? And somewhat theoretically, what should we be doing? The session will be broken into 3 sections with time for discussion at your table in between. Please join me in welcoming the panel to the stage. Alan Fuller, the CIO for Utah, Jim Weaver, Secretary and State CIO in North Carolina, and Brandon Regal, Acting Secretary and State CIO for Illinois.
All right, so glad to kick this off a little bit. Glad to be here with Jim Weaver, who as well as being a friend is a good mentor to me, and also Brandon, who I've been so impressed with. So obviously, fraud is a matter of huge concern to every state government, and we have it poses a huge risk to the integrity of our state programs. It erodes public trust in the government. And, with the pandemic and a huge flow of money coming out, the opportunities, the business model for fraud really increase. And at the same time, states are grappling with this fraud. And just to tee up some of the numbers, can we go to the slides, please? So we've all seen numerous different types of fraud hitting the press. We've seen all types, multiple different types of attacks, different ways in which fraudsters are making money off the government. And the scope of this thing is huge. It's absolutely massive. Next slide, please. So if you look at some of the estimates that are out there, the GAO estimated just unemployment insurance alone over the pandemic was $60 billion. But in a recent article from the Inspector General for the Department of Labor, actually estimated that it's at least $89 billion, or roughly 10% of the total amount. And NBC News recently had an article talking about fraud, and they were speaking with a variety of different experts, both in and out of government, and they estimated that about 80 billion, or about 10% of the 800 billion in the Paycheck Protection Program was stolen. For unemployment, they estimated somewhere between 90 and 400 billion. We don't know the number, but it's really big. And for out of the total of 900 billion for unemployment during COVID was fraud, and then another 80 billion from the COVID disaster relief program. So if you take the high-end estimate for fraud during the pandemic, you take a high-end estimate for unemployment, 400 billion, you add the other 80 billion for PPP and for COVID disaster, you come up with 560 billion in fraud. And, just to put that into a little bit of perspective, the entire, this massive infrastructure spending plan from President Biden, right? That entire 10-year infrastructure spending plan was 579 billion. So, in rough terms, we've had as much fraud over the pandemic as the entire federal government is going to spend on this massive federal spending plan. And just to make it a little more personally relatable, if you do the math, you divide this out, that 560 billion in fraud, divide it by the total population of the United States, which is 332 million, you get an average of $1,687 in fraud for every man, woman, child in the entire United States. So for me and my family, my wife and I, our 7 kids, our 3 grandkids, we're looking at a little over $20,000 on fraud just for our family alone. You throw in the spouses of my kids, closer to $25,000 in fraud. And I don't know about all of you, but that just makes my blood boil. I hate that. I mean, I pay my taxes, honestly. I know you do too. And I want that money to go to things like defense and education and roads and all kinds of good uses for government money. What I don't want it to go to is to the pockets of some thief, to some fraud. It makes me crazy mad. So that raises this question to us as CIOs for the state. What is the role of the state CIO in preventing fraud? What should it be, and what are you seeing? So maybe, Jim, would you like to pick it up there?
Yeah, so North Carolina, within our statute, we're very fortunate to have what we call the Government Data Analytics Center. And if I say GDAC, that's what it stands for, test at the end of the show. But the GDAC is really focused on managing and coordinating enterprise digital integration efforts. And we do that through a series of things. But one of the things it's really looking at is creating efficiencies, detecting fraud, waste, and abuse across government. And we do that through the linkage of data from a number of agencies. For example, and we may talk a little bit later about this, personal identity. We're linking across 50 different identity or personnel administrative systems that exist across the state agencies with good outcomes. We're working very hard to get to the golden record, if you will, with a high degree of accuracy that we can truly identify you as an individual within our system. And what really makes this great is that we're not sitting here taking ownership of that data. At the end of the day, our agencies own that data, but it's the effective use of technology to create these data linkages to get to those types of outcomes. But fraud, we're working on fraud with our Department of Revenue, helping out there on unemployment as well. And again, the last 2 years, we've actually had some national awards from our unemployment folks in that area. So a lot of really good things that our Government Data Analytics Center is doing. And of course, as our folks in the state are working very hard on fraud, our vendors are out there helping us as well. So we got to sit there and bring that up.
Yeah. Brandon.
Yeah, I guess similar to what Jim's doing there, but I think part of the difference is where, when pandemic hit, when really fraud's been around forever, but let's be real, right? Like you said, our agency was about 1.5 years old when that was going on. So growing into that, working with each of the different agencies as they worked through their pains and battles and being partners with them. I think from the CIO, from State CIO's role, it's a multi-layered thing, right? One, obviously ensuring data security, data protection, right? For making sure it's squared away. Making sure our own teams, right? The IT teams are trained, right? Do they understand what we're dealing with? Do they have good secure processes in place? The basics that you would hope that everybody's doing already, but just really doubling down on that across the board. And then really being that partner and the advocate with the business side, right? They know their data, they're taking the pain points, helping them to bring the technology to the table, the right teams to the table. And we've done, like our Department of Revenue, we worked with them quite a bit the last few years. Unemployment insurance, of course, we worked a lot with the last couple of years. A little bit of different approaches on unemployment insurance, identity theft. It was like a major piece that was driving into that. So really working with them to try to lock that front door down from a technology standpoint, helping them to understand, hey, you might need to change some business processes or some requirements to even get in, right? If you want us to really help protect you, you got to help us help you, and we'll make this mission together. Department of Revenue, they actually started using analytics pretty good about 2018, I think, is when it really started doubling down on that. Prior to that, they were seeing about, I think it was around $20 million in fraud detection, where they were able to push it away. Within the first year, that almost doubled. By 2018, 2019, that's up to about 70, right? So it's just helping them to be educated, give them the power to see their data and use them, continually work with them, identify new models, right, to really work that. That's really where we're at today, and I think we'll just keep growing from there.
That's awesome. Appreciate that. It's kind of similar in the state of Utah as well. We're not directly responsible for the unemployment process or program in the state. We have a Department of Workforce Services. They're responsible for that, but we're their IT team. And so for the systems that need to do the checking, so to validate that when someone comes in, they're really who they say they are, they're not a fraudulent person, they really check all the boxes, we are directly involved with helping to build and maintain those systems. So we do play a role. Now, my own feeling is that during the pandemic, I sort of got this feeling that the federal government was kind of like, there was a big push of money, right? Like, get it out. And some of the states were like, well, we don't really have the systems to do this fast. And I got the feeling that it was like, we'll get it out anyway. And because the urgency was to try to help the people in need, right? In the middle of a crisis. But what that led to is if you didn't already have the systems and processes in place, it led to an opening for fraud. And we saw, massive fraud in some areas. Okay, so listen, this is where we do this thing where we go to tabletop discussion. And the three of us are going to leave the stage and walk around, and you are supposed to discuss with the people at your table. The question on the table is, what is the state CIO's role in fraud reduction and prevention? So if you're sitting off at a table alone, I encourage you to, stand up and move with someone else so you can have a good conversation.
No solo tables.
Yeah. We'll take 5 minutes for this, and then we'll come back to the stage. Let me pull you back to the stage up here. So maybe we could take a few minutes and discuss some of the things we heard out there, and then I'll give the next prompt question. Brandon, Jim, what did you hear out there? Maybe you first, Brandon.
I heard about spoofing, right? Just today myself, I got an email that looked very legit from one of our employees asking about their direct deposit, working with them, right? And ironically enough, table I go through, they're talking about, hey, I got this text, I click on this link, reset this. Just about the attempt of continual fraud, right? How do you get in, how do you get in? Because if you can get in with somebody's ID, you're good to go. And I think that's really the conversations we're going.
Yeah.
So I heard centralized versus decentralized, having a standardized identity, a fraud identity access management type process, increased roles of DMV as well. And we also, came across a interesting conversation about, with this being federal dollars and chasing after federal dollar fraud, but you end up using state dollars to chase after the federal dollar, and then who gets the federal dollar back? The federal government does. And so what's the incentive for states to chase after the federal money and spend precious state dollars? So some interesting and diverse conversations out there.
Yeah, I heard some interesting conversations as well. Let me sort of paraphrase what J.R. Sloan from Arizona was saying, was that it was kind of interesting because I think he was talking to some agency leaders, and at one point the conversation was like, what's taking you so long? What's taking you so long to get the money out? And then immediately the conversation changed to, why so much fraud? Why so much fraud, right? It was like this little whiplash thing going on. I know we felt that. A lot of people felt that. Also some interesting conversations about where does the responsibility lie for identity, and that's sort of along the lines of the decentralized versus centralized identity. But questioning, should we have a national identity? Should this be solved? Should this be solved by private sector? Should it be solved by the government? Should it be solved by the state? Who owns the responsibility? And even within a state, if the governor of the state is going to come out with a mandate and say, we got to focus on this, solve this problem, like, who does that mandate go to? Does it go to the CIO? Typically, probably not. It typically goes
to the business.
Typically goes to the business, right? For unemployment, in the state of Utah, for unemployment, it's going to go to the Department of Workforce Services, and we're a partner agency to help them, but we probably don't own the mandate directly. Maybe in some states it does go directly to the CIO. I don't know. What are you doing in your states specifically to combat fraud? Jim, you mentioned the GDAC group. Anything else you'd like to call out in that space?
Well, we started talking about, again, trying to get back to trying to get to that identity model, right? So we can and continue to learn and understand how our residents of our state, our citizens of our states are engaging with us so we can detect fraud quicker, right? And at the end of the day, we're seeing the benefits of that. We're seeing that with the role our Department of Revenue is playing with and having with tax returns. While it's a record-setting year for their processing, they're keeping up with the pace because they're not having to worry as much about the identity fraud issue because things are being detected early on and they're able to go ahead and do that type of resolution up front. And so it's been a good story. Are we perfect? No. Again, as we were talking about some of the fraudulent activities that occurred during the pandemic unemployment situation, I happened to be in a state that didn't have an income tax. And so without having an income tax, to your point, it was about get the money out there, people are in need, but more importantly, the economy needs that money to be spent because we need to get that money back into the general revenue fund. And so at times too, you can have the best intentions and trying to do all you can around fraud detection, but there could be policy decisions being made that have some downstream consequences. And to the point that you're making, it really sounded good, get the money out the door, and in some cases it was 24, 48 hours after application, but then I don't want to say it was the mistake was realized, but once they realized what that impact was, that they slowly pulled that back and it started becoming 5 days, 6 days, because we saw what the downstream consequences were. It was not an IT issue, but we were very much involved in the conversations about what can we do, what can we bring, what are the resources we have, and again, it was trying to bring those disparate data sets together. And so that's what I'm seeing in North Carolina very well. Our Government Data Analytics Center is doing a phenomenal job of bringing these disparate data systems together so we can get to the different outcomes we're looking for.
Yeah, one of the snippets of conversation I heard out there at a table, and sorry if I mischaracterized this, but it was like, hey, where should we start? And we had a mainframe-based system. The word mainframe I definitely heard. And it's like, okay, go get this fraud detection. And then you're like, but my system is this, So, Brandon, what are your thoughts?
So, we talked a little bit earlier, and it seems identity is definitely, in every single conversation we talk about when it comes to this. So, we did take a little bit different approach, I guess, not different than anybody else, but than we had been, right? Really doing, ID verification, validation, like, is this really Brandon, right? What can we do to really show that this is Brandon in some factor more than we did in the past? Other things that from an IT perspective, looking at like, I guess you go like geo-blocking and things like that, right? Where's this traffic coming from, right? If it's coming in from the side, is it coming from overseas somewhere? Is it coming from within the state limits? Is it something that's suspicious that you can really monitor or track and maybe send it to the front door and send it to the actual human being to try to get in that front door versus that? So I think from that perspective, another thing that I know we're working with a lot at the banks, right? Like unemployment insurance, They've been really good to partner with and helping us identify some fraud that we may have missed or some ideas or where they're seeing money getting transferred around in those spaces. Been able to partner up with those quite a bit too to really sniff some things out.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we've seen, it's interesting. We have an open data portal, and even with just the open data that's publicly available for Medicaid, but we have an expert looking at that data. They were able to find some patterns. They were like, hey, wait a minute. This doesn't pass the sniff test, right? And I don't think we've seen convictions or anything yet, but definitely something we're following up with on that team. And it is kind of an interesting balance that we have multiple priorities, right? We're trying to streamline and modernize our state government. We're trying to upgrade processes. We're trying to expand the digital delivery of government services, and really make a tiny scratch in the surface of digital delivery of government services, and you run into the identity problem, right? And of course, in the state of Utah, I don't know how it is for you guys. It sounds like the GDAC people have figured this out pretty well in North Carolina, but we have at least 75 different data stores of ID. And there's probably more that I don't know of. I'm guessing it's probably over 100 by the time we are all said and done, of different places, for ID that we need to pull together to really do, if we're gonna do an enterprise master person index, which we need for our citizen portal.
I was going to say, and so I think it's an interesting thing here, and again, our privacy folks out here too, and I know Cherie loves to bring this up with me all the time, is we have to balance transparency, public records with the data we're putting out there. And if you think about it, a lot of states will end up, our salaries, our information is public record, and to facilitate the interaction with the media requests, things get put online very quickly. What does that allow a threat actor to do? They go screen scrape all that data in one fell swoop. They now have your entire name, salary, and when we start looking at these fraudulent activities, what are some of those key components that you need to complete an application? And so it's going to be an interesting discussion to have. In my state, the governor was part of, he wrote a lot of the open records laws. And there's going to be a balancing act there of trying to, public transparency of the public, but then do we have to, as the threat has changed and evolved over the last 20 years, do we continue to make this type of data that easily accessible that really starts putting our employees at risk and others then that are sitting out there as well? So it's going to be, I'd be curious to hear as you all are talking among your tables as well, what are you doing in your states? And again, I know Cherie has some very good opinions there on what we should and should not be doing in North Carolina as an example. But again, it's going back to that business need. We're not denying the access to the records request, but do we have to make it so readily available that anybody can just go out there and screen scrape it?
Yeah, right on. And we our privacy officer is digging in, and so we're asking agencies, do you have an inventory of all of your record sets? Mm-hmm. No, we don't, right? And so we have some really basic first steps on the crawl, walk, run. We have some crawling to do before we can get to walk and run. Okay, so we're going to turn it back over to you for table discussion. We're going to wander around again. Here's the question prompt that we'd like you to discuss. What can the CIO's office learn from the agencies that have been addressing this issue for a long time already? What can we learn from the private sector? Ready, go. And we're going to walk around again. All right, folks, I know there was some great conversation going on at the tables I walked past. If you can kind of reel it back up here, we'll take the conversation back up here for a minute. So I heard before I jump into things I heard, let me come back to you guys and what did you hear? What are your thoughts?
Well, what I was hearing was there's no one foolproof system, right? There's a myriad of technologies out there. And it's really, we're going to have to do that multifaceted approach to looking at this. A lot of conversation about what foreign countries are doing. India, as an example, has a very high adoption rate on digital identity. I think the number was around 92% right now. As we look at the European nation and some of the things they're doing around biometrics, that also has been very helpful. I'm dating myself, but I can remember back in the late 90s when we were looking at finger imaging as a combative technique for fraud. What that stigma was presenting and what some of the advocates were protesting against, and when you start looking at the data exchanges that started to come about and you start looking at the work requirements, it kind of reduced the need for that. But it was just a lot of that. No one foolproof system, leverage a myriad of things, but the balancing is going to be as you're doing all these different techniques and procedures, what's the impact and how long do you let the person who's waiting for services sit there and wait to receive their benefits or services?
Yeah, Brad, how about you?
Well, I'm not going to try to set anybody out, but I heard a lot about where we're going for the party tonight.
What was the popular vote?
I'll just
okay.
Okay. Yeah, but no, seriously, the discussions I was listening to really kind of went back to, hey, how are we handling identity, right? How are we? It seemed like it just tied back there. One table I talked about, the way that bad actors are getting in by getting information, change as if they were them, change information online and getting their debit cards mailed to them through their benefits, right? Things like that. So it was more about still dragging back the main, I think, topic from the original is how do we ensure that we have the right person there?
Yeah.
And where are we going to the TAP or the FELT or whatever the other one's called down there, I guess.
Yeah, right on. Okay, so I heard three things. So first of all, I heard, now wait, what is this topic? Are we talking about how the CIO prevents fraud or is the CIO a fraud? So that was one. Two.
I hate to ask what that result was.
Whoa. if I lean in, that was like the little bit of a sign. We have, I was listening to, Mandy from Texas and talking a little bit about a situation they have where they have state agencies by statute were allowed to sell certain personally identifiable information that could potentially be used by fraudsters to commit fraud. And you'll have to follow up with Mandy to get all the details straight because I'll probably mangle them. But, selling things like traffic citations or other driver's license data, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, and of course it comes up for debate in the legislature and there's like, whose crazy idea was this? And that's like, oh, sorry, Representative, that was your bill back in the day. There are, to generalize that comment, we do have some kind of outdated practices and processes that leave us as sitting ducks for fraud in some cases that we need to address. And then the third thing, discussion from folks from Louisiana, we're talking about, hey, we've had a big natural disaster. You're the person at the shelter. You've got hungry, homeless people in front of you who obviously need help. And what? You're going to be the IT nerd who's like, let me quickly check. Are you really who you say you are? Right? And it's like, no, you got to help these people who are in crisis. And so there's this balance of urgency and, urgency versus security, and then bring in the privacy piece of it that we have to balance. Any thoughts from those conversations? And we'll jump to another topic.
Yeah, it just sounds like it's the risk mitigation, risk management process. What are you willing to accept as an acceptable loss, and then what is it that you really need to hone in on? So
yeah.
Yeah, I think you just took the words right from me on that. It is really balancing that out and working with everyone to make sure they understand. Because I don't think, what you said earlier, right? Who made this crazy bill? I'm not sure everyone who is actually, pushing some certain topics or the agendas they might want to get, plus the business understanding what their side of the business is and working with IT. It's just a synchronization to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Yeah. Let me take a quick minute to follow up on the other comment that you heard, Brandon, about going back to identity and how do we really prove someone is who they say they are. And we had a pretty good discussion earlier in the day in one of the breakout rooms with Mike Leahy and I were talking. There was some passionate discussion a little bit. I told the story there I'd like to repeat now, so apologies to the few of you who were in the room then. But the topic is about decentralized identity or what we're calling verifiable digital credentials. And I know there's a topic out there for a number of states, but I'll channel a little Don Yeager and tell you a little story, okay? Short story. I want you to imagine my wife at the grocery store, lovely lady, sweet lady. She gets her groceries, she goes to the checkout stand, and for whatever reason, today she decides to pay with a check, okay? My wife doesn't actually pay with a check these days, but suppose she wants to. So she gets out her checkbook, and what does the clerk say? Oh, first of all, the people behind her are like, oh my gosh, how did I get stuck behind the lady with the check, right? But the clerk is gonna say, can I see some ID? So what does my wife do, right? She reaches into her purse, she pulls out her wallet, and in her wallet she pulls out her what? Her driver's license, because a physical credential designed to say that we have the permission to drive on the roads in the state has by default become our main identity document in the state. So she gives her physical driver's license credential to the clerk, who is not really trained in fraud prevention, but looks at the ID, and because they think they know what a Utah state driver's license is supposed to look like, they think they have a valid credential. They might even write the driver's license number on the check. But what other information is on there, right? Her height, her weight, her address, her driver's license number, whole bunch of her birth date, like a whole bunch of stuff that probably isn't really necessary to buy groceries, but it's there. And so there's also another party to this transaction is the issuer of the credential, right? So in this case, it's the driver's license division, state of Utah. So you have here the holder of the credential, probably a bad Don Yeager story, but anyway, there's no punchline. But you have the holder of the credential, who is my wife, right? You have the verifier of the credential, who's the clerk at the grocery store, and you have the issuer of the credential, who is the driver's license division. They call this the trust triangle. I think Sam Smith coined that term. So if you think about how we can do verifiable digital credentials, you have to take that entire transaction and move it to the digital space. The issuer has to have a way to issue a credential. The holder has to have a way, digital wallet example, a way to hold that digital credential. And then the verifier has to have a way to verify both the holder and the issuer of the credential. And you think about across the state, one thing we do really well is issue credentials, right? You can think of dozens of them off the top of your head. Of course, driver's license, birth certificate, immunization record, election card, beekeeper's license, all kinds of professional license, pesticide application license, all this kind of stuff. How can we do all of those in a way that is digital, but also secure, private, scalable? We're kind of grappling with this in the state of Utah as a response to how all this fraud that's coming at us. And we did get a bill passed. If you're interested, you go out and Google up House Bill 470. Bill passed with the recent legislation around verifiable digital credentials. And basically, it's a simple bill. All it does is it puts out some definitions, and it creates a working group for us to go out and work on the issue, and it gives us a little bit of money to go do a pilot. And the pilot, I can guarantee, will not be a primary credential like driver's license or birth certificate. We're looking at doing something like maybe a food handler's permit at the county level or something like that. But anyway, I'm just curious, what other things are going on in the states? And if you were a state legislature, where should they be allocating the money to try to combat fraud? Any thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think it goes back to, again, our agencies are there providing mission critical services to the public. And so it goes back to what are those mission critical services? And again, it's going to be around their business rules. What's the business risk tolerance, and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable? So IT plays an important role in that, but at the end of the day, IT supports the business. So I would sit there and say the focus needs to be more on enabling the businesses to go ahead and
fulfill their mission.
We assist the business by coming in with what we can do from an IT side.
Thanks. Hey, Brandon, so you've talked about identity, what in the, a strong identity infrastructure is the key to combating fraud. What are the key components of a strong identity infrastructure? Where would you see investments need to be made to strengthen that?
Yeah, actually, I want to build off what just talked about too is, in Illinois, our Secretary of State is our driver's license DMV, right? Mm-hmm. They have their own constitutional office. They drive that ID, and you're right. Everyone thinks, oh, I have an ID. Even I'm going to guess, my 19-year-old daughter, when she was in college, probably had one that said she was 21, right? I don't know. I'm not setting her out here. But I think that if we go back and look at the business, what's the mission of that organization, mm-hmm. right? What is that mission, and how do we bring in the right resources to support that? So I think when we were talking about dedicated funding, talking legislation, things like that, really need to focus on really what you're talking about, the triangle, right? How do we get into that? Who owns the responsibility, right? Who owns that from a policy perspective, and then really lay that out.
Excellent.
And as we've had those conversations, again, across the CIO communities here, where Alan, it's really about how do we get to a yes/no response as opposed to this is Mrs. Fuller at 123 Main Street, Salt Lake City, Utah, right?
Right. The classic case for age verification is, let's say, my daughter goes to a bar, which she better not, but if she goes to the bar and they're going to ask for ID, and so she goes to she hands over, well, she's got to hand over all this information when what is really required, and a verifiable digital credential is perfect for this. What you need is a yes/no answer. Does this person hold a state credential that says they're over the age of 21, yes or no, right? That's all you need to know. Yeah. You don't really need to know my actual birth date, my address, my driver's license number, height and weight, etc. So, okay, we're getting close to wrapping up on time. There is, one last question we could just take a quick look at is what is the federal, what are we learning from the federal agencies? And maybe we could just sort of plow through these 5 things. These are some of the GAO recommendations to improve fraud risk management, and I thought they were pretty good. Designating an entity to lead fraud risk management. So in our state, do we have someone who is leading fraud? Is there a specific group or people? Assess the fraud risk, design and implement an anti-fraud strategy, use data and analytics to manage fraud risks, managing fraud risks in an emergency. So I think most states are somewhere on the scale for each of these 5 things. A lot of us are getting pulled to do a lot more than we were done before. Let's go ahead and wrap up quickly. Any final thoughts, Jim, Brandon?
I just think one of the things as IT leaders in our state, CIOs, whatever the case may be, our states have a plethora of data. And part of our job's got to help being that data broker to leverage the data sets that we have. Our agencies at times like to go siloed. They like to keep their data. They don't want to share.
Absolutely.
But there's a wealth of data, property tax records, income tax, DMV, driver's license information. You can just start thinking about the plethora of data that we have out there that we could bring together in a non-threatening manner to actually get us to this outcome and help again. And what I really loved about that slide there that was just up was the management of the risk tolerance. If we're in an emergency, the risk factor might be totally different than if we were in a steady state operation. And we have to balance that.
Yeah. Final thoughts, Brandon?
Yeah, and I think to kind of build on that too, something I mentioned earlier was I think it's important that we're always educating everyone, right? Not just our employees, right? Every single resident that's out there. How do you protect yourself? Because we talk about who owns your identity, right? It's me. I hope I own it the best I can. So I need to understand, how do I protect it? How do I make sure when I'm giving my driver's license, I understand that I'm actually giving all this information out there? So outside of the technology, outside of helping support a mission of an organization to create identity, it's really an effort should be placed on educating across the whole, and then hopefully, as you spar. And then I guess last thing is, no matter where we focus on, it's like the balloon, right? You pinch on it, you choke it, but it just goes somewhere else. The air moves through it. So it's always going to be the whack-a-mole thing chasing around.
Great thoughts. And I think we'll call it a wrap right there. Stay tuned on this topic. I think as a NASCIO community, we'll be talking about this a lot going forward. Thanks a bunch, everyone.